Well, you can't choose how to respond. It is as simple as this. In the face of any kind of hardship. And that's precisely the thing which gives relief, is the realization, the wise realization that your response to a situation of danger or hardship or whatever is not something that you can will, is not something that you can engineer. So, and this applies perfectly to the present situation of COVID-19 pandemic. And so, the thing which gives relief is that when you're afraid, you accept that you're afraid, or when you have an anxiety, when you have depression, you just accept the situation. You don't try to think that, first don't try to change it, don't try to muscle or, manipulate your response, because this will only make things worse. And so you recognize your responses and you accept them, and that in itself gives a lot of relief. This is basically what's meant by anatta. When you understand that your entire repertoire of emotional responses, it's not coming from anything that you control. It's not coming from something that you could call myself. And this applies to any situation of hardship. It applies to pleasure too, the kind of things that you find yourself seeking rather than hating or fearing. That's precisely why I have a problem with all the kind of advices that everyone's giving about how people should respond to the situation. Makes things worse. They don't help at all, because when you fail to respond in this way, you think that there's something wrong with you, or the effort that you put in order to respond in the way that is right, the correct way, the appropriate way. You put too much effort, and that effort in itself is something that, it adds to your worries, it adds to your exhaustion, it adds to your anxiety. There is no such thing as a proper response to a situation of hardship, because the natural situation is that we respond first, and only later, if ever, we become aware of our responses. And that's basically what the practice of mindfulness or sati, or self-awareness, is like. You don't anticipate anything, you just be present to what is already happening. And stop being surprised at your own responses. Recognize that there is such thing as the unconscious, and this is what karma is basically, and it's so full of experiences and habits and attitudes of which we are not even aware. And what makes a situation of hardship potentially very useful is that they evoke, they stimulate these unconscious responses, and that's a great opportunity for one to observe them, because it's usually rare that the unconscious expresses itself at all. That's why, as Buddhist practitioner, you apply yourself to a certain measure of deprivation, of limiting your access to sources of pleasure, because that presses the unconscious. It forces the unconscious to scream out in protest at how much deprived it is. And then you get to see, you get to learn about yourself, you get to see your karma, and that's the necessary in order for one to be able to respond to it in a certain way that leads to its elimination in the future. But you see, things should happen first. That's what's always going to be the case. Is that things will just happen. Emotions will arise. Thoughts will unfold. And only later do we become aware of them. So the idea that there is a right emotion or a right attitude or a correct correct way to respond to something. It doesn't help at all. I don't see it as something that has anything to do with Buddhist practice, to be honest. It's rather the opposite. Don't try to interfere with your experience. Accept it completely. And the reason we don't do that is that we don't want to see. The unconscious is horrific. Nobody wants to see himself or to embrace one's own fear or one's own anger. Nobody wants to do that. Everyone wants to see those things pushed down deeply under the ground, never emerging, never manifesting in the conscious mind. That's what everybody wants. Because nobody wants to be humbled by their own limitations and their own karma, basically. Nobody wants to see that. And what is so remarkable about this ancient Indian psychology is the recognition of the importance of gaining access to the unconscious mind. We will not find this in human history until so much later, very recently, in Western psychology, with psychoanalysis and the first movement in modern times, psychological movement, emphasizes the importance of opening up to one's unconscious habits and attitudes and experiences and so on. That's why hardship is hardship, by the way. It's not that there is a virus or that there is the possibility of death, or that these things in themselves are not inherently or intrinsically fearful. It's that it's not even about us or just about worrying about others. Now, these are all legitimate concerns, but it's possible to respond to them with composure and with stability and balance. The real problem is that we don't want to see our own limitations, our own fears, and we don't want to see that. We don't want that to happen in the first place. And that's why we fear a situation of hardship. We don't want to face a situation of hardship because we know that it will elicit, necessarily evoke from ourselves painful responses, fear, anger, depression, etc. And so when someone says, well, these things are wrong, you should respond with, don't be afraid, be calm, do this, do that. Just trying to engineer your mental state or your emotional state in such a way as to be good, as to be correct. Right? To me, it's the very opposite of what a Buddhist practitioner should be doing, which is to not interfere at all with one's responses and to just watch them, to accept them and to allow them to unfold. With the condition that you remain aware of them, that you don't operate on their basis, and you don't identify with them. That's all that it takes. And that gives a remarkable feeling of relief in therapeutic terms. And secondly, it gives rise to wisdom. You begin to understand yourself. It's humbling. It's not something that makes you feel particularly good about yourself because you're watching your own negative reactions and you can't do anything about them. Nevertheless, in the course of time, at a certain point in the future, you will have transcended these emotional and cognitive and behavioral limitations, at least to a certain extent. And that's better than pushing them deep in the unconscious and suppressing and repressing them completely. I think that's the superior course to be taken from a therapeutic perspective. And I think that's precisely would be the thing that corresponds with the Buddha's teachings, as I understand it. And so, please be free to be afraid or to be angry or to be depressed. You see, but be aware of your mental states and your emotional states, and don't identify with them. And that in itself is going to lead to therapeutic relief, to calm. Of course, the emotions themselves and the mental states themselves are not good. They are bad, but they are not constant. They come and go, and that's another thing that you also observe. You're not always afraid. You're not always depressed. things that just come and go, and that in itself is something that reinforces your view that these are not coming from your own self. It's just evolutionary, natural, unconscious responses. There's no reason to identify with them at all, rather than to try to change them or control them or repress them. All that, I think, deviates from Buddhist practice. And then just relax. That what allows one to relax is precisely this attitude of, yeah, well, let it be. Let my responses be the way they already are. Now, of course, the only time when it becomes important to resort to sangwara or self-regulation or self-restraint is when our responses, our emotional responses, become so prominent that they become manifest in behavior, and when that behavior is potentially harmful to others. This is, of course, really, you could see that happening a lot if you read the news about domestic violence and things of that sort during this difficult situation of the pandemic. Now, this is a situation in which it's, I think, important to try to apply a certain measure of self-regulation and self-restraint. But that's difficult. But there are ways to train oneself in such a way as to see that line separating the okayness of letting feelings and emotions and thoughts unfold, and the other extreme where, well, it's no longer okay when these emotions are causing harm to others, also to oneself. If they reach a certain level of intensity, that becomes hurtful to one's own self, even one's own body too. So long our emotions and emotional reactions in general are not intense and not extreme, I think it's perfectly right to allow them to express themselves and to not try to change or control or suppress them. But once they become too intense, and that's a situation that probably requires attention. And of course, there are meditative means, and there is much that Buddhist psychology can offer by way of advice in this case, which I might talk about later. But also, once emotions and behavioral reactions become too intense or extreme, it may also be important to seek professional help of psychologists or a psychotherapist or something of that sort. And that's generally the idea, I think, that in a minority of cases, you might find your emotions going to extremes, and then it's important to try to calm down and to try to do something about these intense reactions. Otherwise, it's really perfectly right to be afraid. It's perfectly right to be angry or depressed or the whole spectrum of negative emotions. So long you be patient and you maintain self-awareness, you are aware of these states, you don't identify with them, and they go away, and you come back to light. That's everyone's experience. The most advanced practitioners of the Buddha Dhamma experience the exact same thing until they attain sainthood. It's the exact same thing. These episodes and periods of darkness of whatever kind, of various kinds, they come, and you just endure them, and you remain patient, and you maintain self-awareness with regard to them. This is what the Buddha did at the night of his deliverance. He just remained unmoved by these things, but constantly aware of them until it was over. That's what a Buddhist practitioner does. You don't try to change him. It's not possible to change him. It's not possible to choose how to respond. That's the most important thing. And I really take issue with all these advices that instruct people about how they should feel or how they should think and all that sort of thing. It places further pressure on people. It puts more load on them. And I think it's the exact opposite. You just let everything express itself freely so long you do not identify with all these mental states that are expressing themselves.